Good morning, everybody. My name is Jonathan Ong. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks especially to Miyase and Isabel for putting together a beautiful program and creating this much needed space for interdisciplinary dialogue and reflection is something I really believe in. I feel really bad for not being there. Clearly, there are limits to cosmopolitanism, which is funny given the theme of the event. But I look forward to discussing later on during question time over Skype any issues and opportunities for collaboration. So, my presentation today is entitled Belonging After the Storm Compulsory Cosmopolitanism and Queer Recoveries. And the aim of this presentation will be to record everyday and unexpected modes of survival and just being following disaster. Following queer theorists Eve Sedgwick and Lisa Henderson, I argue that ordinary acts of healing, coping, and forming intimate attachments are preconditions for full flourishing. And I explore these aspects and practices in relation to the specific experiences of LGBT people after disaster. So, engaging with the idea of home, which is the key concept of today's event, I explore how the breakdown of physical home and community after disaster, after rupture, can also paradoxically enable temporary belongings and new imaginations, particularly for marginalized communities whose identities have been historically repressed and perhaps unwelcome in a conservative small town community. So there are new opportunities that arise out of cosmopolitan experiences and socialities, but at the same time, there are risks to consider. And I'll be exploring these in my short talk today. So, as a brief background, my talk draws from a British Council Newton Fund funded project, the Newton Tech for Dev Network, which I currently convene at the University of Leicester. And it's an interdisciplinary, intersectoral network that explores digital technologies in low and middle income countries. And we're specifically interested in looking at communication technologies during crisis response. And I I look forward to hearing more from other participants later on about opportunities to collaborate. So the material that I will be drawing from today is ethnographic work that I have finished in the city of Tacloban, an ethnographic work that I conducted with a team of researchers, including Mirka Madianu, and we started our research in the area 6 months after Typhoon Haiyan hit Tacloban in central Philippines. And we did interviews and participant observation with affected people as well as with aid workers. And we were looking specifically at communication technologies and how they were implemented as ways to help people in the recovery process. As an ethnographic project, however, we were able to explore much more beyond just communications and attended to the slow process of recovery, as you can see in this slide. And not just a slow recovery, but a very uneven recovery where you see gentrification happening in the city center, while outside of the city center, people still continue to live in tent cities over a year after Typhoon Haiyan hit. So, in our other papers, my colleagues and I have engaged with the concept of voice in social theory and how disaster affected people can gain a voice, particularly from the use of social media and mobile phones. And so, voice, we approached it and operationalized it from the perspective of digital protest, digital crowdsourcing, digital fundraising that the community can benefit from. So today I tried to shift this focus of voice in its most political and public register and looking at voice in its more social register, perhaps. And I'll be drawing from queer studies to look into everyday modes of survival and just being after rupture. So, from queer theory, I draw reparative critique to identify the communicative practices, social attachments, and forms of belonging that become especially meaningful for queer subjects following the event of rupture and distress. One argument that I pose here is that prior to thriving and flourishing or achieving expressions of political voice, we need to record the everyday politics of survival and coping and record the achievements and agency of people in these kinds of contexts. So I explore this specifically in relation to LGBT experiences in disasters, and their experiences are usually quite invisible and not recorded in the literature or in aid workers' documents. So, and LGBT people have also experienced discrimination in context of crises. So, particularly in how aid has usually applied and adopted very heteronormative categories. Nevertheless, I aim to recognize their agency. After all, LGBTs possess a studied resilience, having previously endured other calamities of homophobia and crises of identity, opening up potentials for queer forms of recovery. So my project's key questions would be to explore LGBT experiences in the disaster, how disasters themselves are inherently queer, and what might be opportunities and risky potentials of queer cosmopolitan socialities. And I'm trying to engage with these questions in a paper that I'm developing for a journal special issue that Miyase is editing and putting together. So I draw upon the notion of queer time today to refer to nonlinear experiences of time and life stages that do not correspond to heteronormative institutions of family and reproduction. And I think queer time is especially useful to apply in the context of disasters, which would tend to assume very technocratic definitions of stages of recovery and rebuilding. So I also engage and extend the literature on ordinary cosmopolitanisms by trying to explore the queer experience of cosmopolitanism. And with this notion, I intend to capture the ways in which cross cultural attachments and relationships enable the sharing and repurposing of wounds after rupture, and how healing may happen in forms of boundary crossing and transgression. And I hope that this concept would capture the constrained and risky agency of vulnerable bodies in communion with and through pain. And in the next slides, I will try to draw from two short vignettes from my fieldwork. So, one of the most interesting spaces that I frequented during my fieldwork in Tacloban 6 months after Typhoon Haiyan was Burgos Street, which was in downtown Tacloban, which became home to a disaster hipster scene and also became a home for gay globality, if you will. So on Burgos Street, a few steps away from the headquarters of aid workers, a mobile truck bar would park on a pebbled lot, and it would serve expat priced beer and cocktails. And beside it would stand an alfresco burger joint with hipster trappings of reclaimed wood furniture, snacks served on cutting boards, even vegetarian options. And this truck bar would attract an assortment of foreign workers, religious volunteers, and curious locals. And people would be very friendly and chatty, very welcoming, in spite of being very weary and tired from the day's work. So this space was one of the key spots for cosmopolitan nightlife and intermingling between foreigners and locals. And other scholars, such as Naomi Klein, in her book The Shock Doctrine, might explore and consider such spaces as demonstrating disaster capitalism, which would be spaces which would drive up prices for basic goods, also driving out locals from their home, and would see such spaces as spaces of exploitation and domination. However, I would argue that this is only one such reading that would empty out the potentials of exploitative spaces as also having simultaneously potentials for transformation and transgression. So, particularly for the small group of gay and lesbian local Taclobanons I met, who were regulars of this space, They felt a sense of belonging and acceptance in a conservative Catholic small town that has historically excluded them. And it was only when hanging out with liberal and open minded foreign workers that some of them felt comfortable in their own skin, able to express their identity, even able to come out as gay for the first time in their hometown. So this occurred, of course, in a very specific, exceptional queer time following disasters, where normal rules and hierarchies were suspended. So I would argue that this space, while it was a space of openness and hospitality, if you will, this is also a space which is also exclusionary, particularly in how low income, lower class LGBT people and lower class Filipinos were excluded as they were unable to afford entry to these spaces. So the cosmopolitanization of the physical environment was also instantiated and evidenced in digital spaces. And I think about this in relation to dating apps such as Tinder and Grindr, locative dating apps, which also demonstrate and instantiate, bring into visual evidence through able bodied torsos that would appear in these apps. The cosmopolitanization of the wider physical environment. And I think one of my respondents in my field work said it best when he said, overnight, my grinder literally became the United Nations, referring to not only the presence of the aid agency in his locale, but also the diverse set of able bodied torsos on the app. And so, in the immediate aftermath of Haiyan, patchy cell phone signal notwithstanding, survivors longing for intimacy turned to dating apps to arrange for discreet meetups with aid workers who in turn sought distraction, and neither sought longevity or commitment. So I try to approach disaster dating, recognizing their opportunities for cosmopolitan sociality, but also the risks inherent in this. So, for one, aid agencies actually formally prohibit such practices in their professional code of conduct and ethics policies. However, aid workers individually justify these relationships based on language of romantic love. Some would also argue that these locals that they form relationships with are not direct beneficiaries of aid but are middle class locals. However, power hierarchies remain. And the second point is that racial hierarchies end up being reinforced rather than transgressed in these spaces as white bodies are coded as more desirable, given also local colonial histories. So, just to summarize and give a closure to this talk, I would argue that unlike the concept of voice, which gestures towards the political aspects of recovery and agency, the attachments formed in queer cosmopolitanisms yield immediate and intimate outcomes for the self. They draw attention to people's urgent and everyday concerns for coping and healing and just being. And they might not always line up with official concerns, which would prioritize perhaps organization, community collaboration. I would argue that perhaps these forms of political voice will require an investment in a future that not all people can imagine or afford, especially in the queer time following disaster. After all, while there is a promise that personal attachments can enable belongings to a gay globality never before experienced in this small town, it's important to look into the local exclusionary politics that play out based on class and religion. So, a final statement, queer cosmopolitanism hopefully makes us sensitive to how the unlikeliest of cures can treat and salve the deepest of wounds, and hopefully it would open our eyes to human beings' inherent queerness and woundedness beyond only the visible event of catastrophe. Thank you.